So for me, they're not thinking about systems at all. They're talking about breaking something that they think is controlling them. And I think that goes back to this when we bring it back into education, power and control isn't seen in schools. It's so nuanced. It's like, I think a lot of people wouldn't be able to name what it looks like within schools.
Welcome to Rethinking Education. Education's critical friend.
Hello, Earthlings, carbon-based life forms, and indeed visitors from other dimensions. Welcome to the Rethinking Education podcast. My name is James Mannion.
And my name's David Cameron.
Indeed. So have you always been a David? Are you ever Dave? Do you go through a Dave phase? Were you David when you were naughty?
I've been everything. I've been Dave, I've been Davy, I've been David.
Davy. I can't see you as a Davy.
Yeah,
I wouldn't dare with that.
Yeah, well, there you go. That's been the most consistent.
Right.
I did a prize giving in a school up in the north of Scotland, and at the end of it, one of the parents came up to me, and they just looked at me and he went, "David Cameron, you were never David when I knew you. You were Dave." And I went, "And who were you?" And he was a former pupil. I was like, "Mate, I should have been sir," you know. So
I was presuming that you were like David when you were in trouble as a kid, and then you just like stepped into that naughty persona. Is that right?
yeah. Well, there's an element of that, I'm sure.
Yeah. Okay. So how are you? What have you been up to? You were mentioning that last time we spoke, you were about to go and see David Byrne.
Fantastic. Absolutely. One of the best shows that I've ever seen in my life. I loved his last American Utopia tour. It had all the elements of that, no static instruments, all the musicians on the move all the time. The light show, the staging was absolutely breathtaking. It was just so rich and fabulous. And the music was a brilliant mix, old, new. He didn't play his new album through, which he often does when he's touring, and then do some extras. The whole show was much more mixed, just really, really powerful. And everybody was there. You know, me, Benedict Cumberbatch, one of the Gallagher brothers, there were all sorts of celebrities rolling in there, and the buzz on it has just been absolutely incredible. Tour's still going on. Tickets are astronomical at times, but
Yes.
it's one of the few occasions where I've actually thought, man, this was worth it. This was so worth it.
Wow. There you go. I have barely concealed envy. I really want to see that. I wonder if there's any more dates. I'm going to see if I can save up my pennies and catch any of this tour. He's still touring in the UK.
He is still touring in the UK. He's here
I'm
for
making
a
a note
while.
right now because that is praise indeed. American Utopia. That sounds like a good idea.
Yeah. It sounds like something we should be nostalgic for,
We
doesn't
should
it?
maybe try that.
Yeah.
Yes. Wow. Well, I can't compete with Benedict Cumberbatch, but I went to the theatre recently and Dylan Moran was sitting behind me.
Oh, brilliant. Well,
Yeah,
that's good enough for me. I'm a
that's good
huge
enough.
Dylan
And
Moran fan.
very pleasingly, he was guzzling wine. He was fully in Bernard Black mode.
All
Um,
right.
Black Books has just been one of the staples in this house. We've watched it, I don't know how many times. It's so good, that show.
Great.
Um,
And what have you been up to? What's been happening in your life?
well, I took 2 days off in the last week to write a new rock musical, little holiday from educational stuff.
Wow.
Written one. We had our first run through at the weekend, and we're screening it. We're running it and doing a live version in June this year. It might be our fringe show for next year, which is really fun. So lots of music. Hit a bit of a creative purple patch recently. I was sort of stuck for ages. I didn't write any new songs for ages, and now they're coming thick and fast, which is very nice problem to have. I've been out in some with my work hat on. I've been working out in some schools recently. There's one school in particular that was maybe worth mentioning, which is that there's a school that got in touch a while ago. So the senior team had all read the book Making Change Stick, and they have done quite a bit of thinking. Like the head teacher's office, they sort of rearranged all my ideas, and he's got this big like display of this, and it's all connected to these other leadership ideas, and they're doing some really heavy lifting with this. And what they've done brilliantly is that they've rejigged their school day. Like it says in the book that like step one is to carve out the time and space in which you should to make this work happen. And they've really taken that on board. And so they've rejigged their Wednesday. So they got rid of tutor time. The lessons start half an hour earlier. And then they shaved off 5 minutes off each lesson that day. So they carved out an hour a week within working hours. And every other week they do coaching in that time. And then that alternates with slice team stuff. So they're creating currently 6 slice teams, each looking at a different area of school improvement. And I went in and did a whole day of training with them, with all of their senior and middle leaders, and then a separate half day with the whole staff. And it really has a lot of relevance with the conversation that we're having today with Dee Nic Sitric about power. And indeed, I met Dee off the back of a webinar that I did about slice teams, and we got talking about what that means for power dynamics in schools. And I just thought that this was going to be a really rich conversation. I hadn't met her before, but just based on, and I couldn't see it, it was just this disembodied voice on a webinar. But I was like, we need to do a podcast with this person. And so I reached out via Tina. So Tina Farr, friend of the podcast, has put us in touch, and a very fantastically interesting conversation it was too. What are your takeaways from this conversation with Dee?
Yeah, I loved it. And I think one of my big takeaways is it sits perfectly with my current favourite quote from James Baldwin, that those who say it can't be done are usually interrupted by those actually doing it. And she sets up what sounds like an almost unattainable goal for relational practice and connectivity, and then cites Tina Farr, whom you've mentioned, as one of the schools that's actually putting everything that she says pretty much into practice.
Mm-hmm.
So it's something that sounds as if it can't be done, but actually can.
Yeah. And just a long overdue topic of conversation. We spend quite a bit of the conversation talking about why is it that we don't talk about power more. Like it seems to be something that sort of went a bit out of fashion, like Foucault and Bourdieu and so on, like both wrote books about power relations and the way that this shapes human behavior and culture and so on. But it's kind of gone out of fashion a bit, maybe. Like people are not talking about it in the way that they were, say, like 50 years ago or so. But I think that we should drag it kicking and screaming back into the spotlight, because it's just at the heart of so much of what's going on in our schools and in the wider society, the uses and abuses of power. And so a timely conversation, this one, but it's a really rich one, and I'm sure that our listeners and viewers will get as much out of it as you and I did.
And I agree with that. Looking forward to it.
All right, everyone. Hope you enjoy the show. Dee Nic Sitric, welcome to the Rethinking Education podcast.
Thank you. Very excited. Bit nervous, but excited.
We'll be gentle. We'll be gentle. I'm if I may, I'm kind of like not nervous on your behalf, having had 2 conversations with you previously, both of which were very, very interesting, and I'm confident that we'll make the third time just as successful. And so just for the benefit of our listeners and viewers who may not have come across you before, could you please just do like a quick intro to yourself and the work that you currently do?
Yep. So my name is Dee Nic Sitric, Deirdre. I'm originally from Ireland, Dublin, and I now am the founding director of a CIC, a small community interest company based in Oxfordshire called Autism Champions. And we are a neurodivergent led. So I'm autistic ADHD. Most of my team are either autistic, ADHD, some kind of neurodivergence, and they've got living experience of both. And we work alongside anybody really who's keen to understand how the neurodivergent brain and the neurodivergent experience fits within the current system, especially within education and systems within the NHS as well. So we've been commissioned by CAMS, we've commissioned by, we're currently part of the Alternative Education Provision Programme within Oxfordshire. We're on their framework. And I do a lot of work as kind of, I suppose, an expert by experience, an experienced expert for boards for Bob, which is the old Buckinghamshire, Oxfordshire and West Bars ICB, which is now, I believe, as of tomorrow, maybe going to be the Thames Valley ICB. Very nice, shiny new, but not really, kind of same thing. So we do things around ADHD, we do things around learning disability and autism, and yeah, so that's what I do. Anything to do with systems, really, and how we see systems and how it works. Yeah, my brain just goes on fire and I love it.
Yeah, I was just going to be my follow-up question. So just before we started recording, you were saying that you're a serial course taker.
Yes.
And that you're currently doing what did you call it? A systemic master's?
Yeah, so I've just applied to complete my master's. It's a 4-year master's in family systemic psychotherapy. And the one I've kind of chosen to finish is at Birmingham. The reason is because there's a chap there. For me, it's John Burnham. He's a really interesting thinker. I like the way he thinks. I like a lot of his writing. And also there's no thesis at the end. It's a lot of continual assessment, which is good for me as well, because I get a bit paralyzed by that kind of idea of having to write a huge thing, because I'll just get very sidetracked, and it's hard for me to produce something that big. So
okay,
it's that reasonable adjustment, isn't it? It's trying to find an education for me, even learning still at my age, to try and find education that works for me in a system that finds it very difficult to be flexible. Even at this point, when we're going to be talking about, I know we're going to be talking about power and stuff within that, it's how do we make these systems feel useful and helpful for everybody who's involved in them, rather than just the kind of institution that's kind of running it and those who are teaching it and the governing bodies.
Nice, thank you. So just to explain to people how this conversation came about, and it sort of links to this idea of systems. And so I recently wrote this book, Making Change Stick, and my publisher, Hachette Learning, like put together this series of little webinars that we ran. We did 3 webinars to sort of introduce people to the big ideas, and you were on. Yeah, there was. I think it was probably the first one, which was about slice teams, which is like the big idea that drives this whole approach, really, which is where it's a upending of the system essentially, which is often top down. And instead of that, we had this, we use these slice teams where you take a cross section through the organization, for anyone not familiar with this. And so instead of just having the senior leaders in a school calling the shots and telling everybody what to do, you have a slice team looking at a particular area. So, some of the schools that I work with looking at, it could be parental engagement, it could be about the curriculum, it could be about mental health and well-being, or extracurricular stuff. You can look at all kinds of things where you have a cross section. So you're looking at this through the eyes of an early career teacher and, for example, a young person with autism, and parents and governors and site staff, lunchtime supervisors, middle leaders, all the people who have some valid perspective on this. And it's really interesting when you work in this way. You get much better decisions made because you're looking at it through all these different lenses. And you also get buy-in, like people come with you because they can see that they are empowered in some sense, that their voice is being not just seen and heard, but they can actually influence the shape of this thing as it unfolds. And then I don't remember exactly how. I think you just like asked some interesting questions, and we ended up ending that webinar, just you and I, just having this like long conversation about power in schools, and you've done lots of thinking about this already, it seems. But I wonder, just before we throw over to you, just bring David in here, because David also has been thinking about this recently, and this might help to sort of to frame the conversation a little bit.
Yeah, I did a thing last week as part of a series called How to Say No to the System.
Ah.
And I finished up having this really interesting conversation because I think that slogan has now become the battle cry of the right. So the people that are really trumpeting the fact that they're saying no to the system are Trice and Farage and Trump. And it's really interesting. And I was trying to draw a line between standing up to the system and standing up for yourself and trying to make that interesting dichotomy, if you like, around what we're up against. And I was really intrigued because so much of what you talk about is systems and systemics. I mean, one of the things that I was talking about was that in effect, we've destroyed the system in lots of ways in this country by removing regulation. So we've now got rivers full of shit, and we've got natural woodland full of dumped crap that's been put there by organised crime, which we can't prosecute because we don't have a system any longer. So there was
Yeah.
lots of stuff that I was really interested in around that. So I'm intrigued by particularly what you think of as the system, if you like, and also what you think about as the power dynamics in schools, particularly.
Mhm. Oh, my brain is on fire.
That's the job. That's what we're
Yeah,
here for, Dee.
yeah,
We're off
amazing.
to the races.
We are off to the races. There's loads of different stuff there, isn't there? There's something here about what the system is, and when we wanted saying we're kind of buck the system, that kind of goes against systemic thinking because the idea of systemic thinking is that people are curious about what's going on, and those like Farage, Trump, all of those kind of that like right side that are really trying to change or trump this or whatever, say no to the system. They're just interested in creating a system that works for them. They're not interested in hearing people's voices and understanding how people experience the world around them and what works for them and what doesn't work for them. And this idea of kind of within systemic thinking, we talk about relationship to help and what help looks like for different people. And, you know, in schools, this links really well into schools because actually what help looks like for someone who works during the dinner session, so maybe one of the kitchen staff, looks very different from what help looks like to a teaching assistant who's doing maybe some one-to-one work with a child who has like a significant learning disability, and also help for a head teacher who's in kind of crisis currently because they haven't got a lot of money coming into the school and there's kind of real financial difficulty. So for me, it's they're not thinking about systems at all. They're talking about breaking something that they think is controlling them. And I think that goes back to this when we bring it back into education. Power and control isn't seen in schools. It's so nuanced. It's like I think a lot of people wouldn't be able to name what it looks like within schools. I'd be interested in having conversation. I was thinking about when it was. I think it was Rishi Sunak when he was going for the leadership role. And I was thinking about, you know, if himself and I don't know, somebody else was having a chat, if they turned around and said, "So, Rishi, what was it like for you growing up as a, you know, a young lad where you came from with your kind of background and your kind of cultural understanding and all of that? It must have been really different for you. Like, can you imagine if they were the conversations they were having on TV? Rather than people just saying, well, the Tories didn't do that well, the Greens didn't do that well, these guys didn't do that well, you didn't do that. This is what we're doing. This is what we're doing. There's no thought in how people's lived experience impacts the decisions they make and then impacts how those decisions are then followed through. And then this comes back to this co-production idea, which people are throwing all around, which is a slice team in itself, this idea of co-production. But actually, co-production lots of times is just said, oh, this is co-produced. It's not co-produced. Someone is asked their opinion, and then they don't see how that information is used. They don't see any follow-up. They're not asked about that from the beginning all the way through to the end. It reminds me of, do you know Schwartz rounds?
No.
Okay,
No.
so Schwartz rounds, it comes from the States, but they do use it over in the UK and Ireland now. It's mostly within a medical field, but the idea is that they get, it might be, and it's generally around like incidents, but it happens once a month within organizations. And I love the idea of it because it is a slice team. They get maybe three people. So there might be the consultant psychiatrist or the consultant I don't know, rheumatologist who was involved, and then it might have been the pastor or the kind of whoever was there representing kind of pastoral care within the hospital or the ward at the time, and then there might have been a parent or a cleaner. And it was based around talking about the impact of an incident on the team. And they use it in healthcare because it felt like there was so much emotion linked to the work. And I think this goes back to education and people thinking that there's no bloody emotion connected to the work within education. Oh my God, we spend our day with young children. We spend our day with people, which is relational. And yet no one talks about relational teaching. And so I'm going around in circles here, like there's 700 billion ideas there, but you can see where we're going. Like this idea of systemic stuff, systemic is relational based. It's about curiosity. And when we think about curiosity, we cannot be judgmental and curious at the same time.
Let's rethink education.
Hello, Earthlings. This podcast is brought to you by Crown House Publishing. Crown House have published many of the most influential books of recent years, certainly many that have been the most influential on my own thinking. Things like When the Adults Change by Paul Dix, A Curriculum of Hope by Dr. Deborah Kidd, and The Wonderful Botheredness by Howell Roberts. They have also published an amazing card-based resource called Activate, a professional learning resource designed to help people develop their thinking and their practice around self-regulated learning, which is designed on my own doctoral research and which I created with my erstwhile colleagues at the Centre for Educational Leadership in the UCL Institute of Education. Anyway, as listeners to the podcast, or indeed viewers, you can receive a 20% discount on all titles from the Crown House website if you use the promo code REPOD20. That's REPOD20, all caps. That offer does exclude bundles and existing promotions, though. So head over to crownhouse.co.uk and treat yourself, or perhaps a colleague, or indeed 10 or 20. That's crownhouse.co.uk, REPOD20. Okay, let's get back to today's pod.
And this is really even more interesting because the How to Say No to the System series came out of this loose collaborative called the Scottish ACES Action Committee, who are primarily advocates of relational practice and are pushing for that and pushing for much more of an understanding and compassionate approach towards children and young people than they perceive the system in schools currently operating. So a massive overlap, I think, between where that conversation came from and where your conversation's coming from. But I found that a really helpful characterization of what you're talking about. So it's about openness, about curiosity, about listening. That's the model.
And I think there's something like you've said there that it's about, how, or you talked about kind of how children, that relational aspect within schools for children, compassion and everything. I think, when we think of schools, we do think of children, but I think we also need to remember that there is a whole staff team and they come with their own stuff. They come into the field for whatever reason. I think I wrote a paper for it was my psychological observational studies. I wrote it on systems, and surprisingly or unsurprisingly, and it was actually, I didn't realize at the time it was about systems, but it was Whose Pain Is It Anyway? That was the title. And it was talking about how teachers, especially within special education, come into the field, and teaching assistants and support workers come into the field of teaching, and particularly in this area, because they have experienced their own trauma, or they've experienced their own difficulties within that system. And then they can try to come join this system to be part of it, to try and make a difference. And then very quickly they get stuck in it, and it all just becomes that kind of quagmire of working within education and health, and that kind of crossover. And it becomes very kind of messy and unclear. And I'm not saying that systemic work is clear. But it is about that curiosity of why things are happening. Why did we make that decision? Who made that decision? Why did that person make that decision at that particular time with those people? I'm curious about why someone would not involve this team when they've involved this team, and who can ask those questions. And that's the power thing, I think, in schools, is who's allowed to ask questions. And you talk about psychological safety. When there's no psychological safety, people cannot ask questions. They think they can, but they're not going to ask the questions they want to ask, are they? Because they don't feel safe. And I don't think children can ask questions, because we're still in that idea that if a child questions something, they're seen as difficult, defiant. There's still that idea that they don't have that agency or that autonomy to be able to question an adult. And this is the power that we're always coming up against, is that we have a lot of young people who come into education, autistic, ADHD, very clear in their own idea of what they like and what they don't like and what works for them. And most of the time that stuff is just ignored, or actually the opposite is done, because they have to fit into what's available at the time, rather than people being curious about, oh, interesting, I'm wondering why that works for you, rather than we don't have a staff member for that.
Yeah. Now it's my mind that's going off in like a million different directions. I keep settling on a different follow-up question every 3 seconds. This is such an interesting topic. Like, I want to get into this, and you talked about psychological safety. I want to get into how this plays out at the staff level and then also at the student level. But first of all, just to come back to, you mentioned earlier that people don't talk about this very much. It's not something that's that's discussed really, either within schools or in the discourse, online. People are not talking about this, and yet you see it playing out all of the time in the ways in which people talk about behavior management, for example. Even in something like in my own area, like in oracy, I've been thinking of writing something for a while about oracy. And when you teach children how to speak and listen more, there's something that's really profound that happens there, which is it's not just like teaching them a skill, like how to juggle or how to conjugate a verb or whatever. It's like they find their voice physically, but also metaphorically. And there's a power shift that happens there in a lesson where the teacher, sometimes, teachers talk to control. They dominate the narrative of the lesson by being the person who does most of the talking and most of the questioning and so on. And when you set up the conditions where the students are discussing things more, the power, the control of that lesson has shifted from the teacher to the students, and that can be really uncomfortable in all kinds of ways. If the kids don't know how to hold that, they don't know how to interact together in healthy ways, group work can very easily go wrong quite quickly, and it can just feel like a bit of a mess. But there's something that's very interesting there, and I noticed when the government announced that oracy was going to be a thing, I really almost like on that very day there was people online, like the trads were sort of going, right, this is our oracy. Our oracy is like call and response. It's choral stuff. It's like no opt out, putting kids in the spotlight and saying, give me an answer sort of thing. Whereas, people who might consider themselves more progressive would be more about, this is about a dialogic, understanding, like it's like shared meaning making, and something that's a lot more sort of bottom up sort of thing. And so the power dynamics just play out. It's endlessly fascinating. But I just wonder, like, why is it that you think that it's discussed so rarely? Why is it that this is sort of like this massive, massive topic that is just really not discussed much?
Fear.
Go on.
Well, I think there's a fear that if we begin to discuss this, it will need to be looked at. It will need to be thought about. Something will need to shift. We will need to start thinking, oh, actually, that's not okay. How we're engaging with these young people perhaps does need to be thought about. Like, I'm thinking about a particular school and a brilliant head teacher, really kind, really capable, knows all the kids' names, knows pretty much all the parents' names, like mind blown. Rocked up to the school, and within 3 weeks, he had all the kids' names. Like just, and I know that's a skill, right? I know some people just don't have that, but he just brilliant. And yet, having kind of walked around the school at different times for different reasons, I was at an assembly and the whole school were sitting in an assembly hall. First of all, why? Just sticking it in there, you stick 300 kids in a room, you're going to get some noise. Okay, just putting it out there. If you don't think you're going to get some noise, then you're bonkers. Okay, it's like even the idea of it just makes me think, oh my goodness, why? And then they had this music playing, and the kids were excited because we were in to talk about something specific and they knew why we were there. And it was like, whoa, and we were both knew some of the children in the audience. And then he turned around and said, these two people over here are watching you absolutely embarrass yourselves because you can't stay quiet. We don't do that. And I was just like, wow. So at that point, he took power from the children, but he also took power from me. As an external person coming in, my power was completely stripped and I hadn't even said one single word. And I was like, right, how do I, oh, and I'm not someone to shy away from saying something, but it's that moment of, how do I do this in a way that he doesn't lose power? Because it's not my idea then to turn around and kind of shame somebody because he's shamed other people. We don't do that. But by naming it, we're not shaming. We're just holding people accountable for their behavior. Now, that's very difficult because he is the head teacher. I am a visiting person coming in, and we have 300 children in the room, plus teachers. So you can, and at that point, I was just like, oh my goodness, do I stay quiet? Do I not stay quiet? So I actually I let it go for a minute and then when we started speaking, I named it then. I was like, I was really interested in what it was like to be in a room with all of these people and for our head teacher here to be here. And he's so incredibly proud of this school and wants to show how incredible you guys are. And his idea of that might be that you're all sitting still and quiet. But it's so hard to sit still and quiet when we're about to talk about what we're about to talk about, right? And it was so interesting that he suddenly stopped and he looked at me. And I said, I felt quite uncomfortable at that point. I'm wondering if anyone else felt a bit uncomfortable. Yeah. And the little kid just goes, I don't know how to move my body right now because I just want to jump up and down because all we're going to talk about is Christmas. And I'm like, exactly. So it was that moment of not shaming anybody, not kind of taking anybody else's, but it's empowering by naming very difficult things in a way that is curious rather than judgmental. But this idea of when we talk about power, people automatically assume that the power is static.
Right.
Yeah. We don't, and I think also people don't understand when we think about power, especially in education within schools, what power looks like. Is power to do with hierarchy? So is the head teacher more powerful than a 5-year-old in early years? But I know for a fact that a 5-year-old in early years can stop that whole school still for a good 2 hours because they've decided to climb a gate and go. So who has the power in that position? But is it a known power? Is it a named power? Is it an unconscious power? I think we need to really think about here when we're thinking about power. It's about who feels the most able to say what they feel and how they want something to be done. That for me is where the power lies. And most of the time, there is like probably 1% of people within an education setting that have that power.
I'm really interested because I've worked in a number of schools, and hierarchically, I've been pretty close to the top
Yeah.
in terms of school leadership. And I've also, in educational system terms, I was director of children's services. So that hierarchical power is something that's been with me at various times in my career. And I've got caught up a lot in this idea of what are problems with behaviours and what are problems with systems. So I've worked in schools where the power did lie with a particular group of staff who, as you say, were fearless about what they were prepared to say and what they were prepared to do. And they created a culture that made it very intimidating for people to go against them. And they had very particular views about how young people should be treated and all of that. I've been in schools where the power sat very comfortably with the hierarchy. I've also been in the kind of schools that you're describing, where kids could just bring the whole place to a stop. I mean, I had a wonderful conversation with a group of kids in Kibble, which is the largest residential school in Scotland. And they'd given me 40 kids to work with for an hour. And I'd said to them, so people think you're mental, eh? And they all went, yeah, we are. And they all sounded like they'd been in The Exorcist. And I said, no, you're not though, because when we've got all the answers, you destroy the conversation.
Yeah.
When we've got all the arguments, you destroy the discussion. When we think you're acting out, in fact, you're acting in, because you don't mind the chaos and you know we hate it.
Yeah.
And this big guy at the back of the room just looked at me and he went, how long have you known? And that just struck me as the most extraordinary statement of where power lay anywhere that boy was.
Yeah.
So, are we talking about things that are endemic in the system, or are we talking about behaviours that exist at different points within that system?
It's so interesting then, isn't it? Because obviously this young man saw himself as having a power, but also the cost to him to be where he is on at that point in his life, that actually being completely powerless is what led him to there, most likely, right? Not having
Mhm.
been able to make decisions, not feeling like he had any autonomy, not feeling like this. So then he's gone the kind of, in a sense, if we're thinking about behaviorally, he's gone to the kind of right, that far right side, hasn't he? To,
Yeah.
well, I'm just going to control it all because that's where safety lies for me. And it's kind of akin to what we were talking about earlier, this idea of kind of booking the system, but it's not really about booking the system, it's about controlling the system because that's where people feel safe.
Mm. Mm.
So, and I think this goes back to what you said, why is power not talked about? Fear, because there's lack of safety in when we begin to talk about this, because people can open something. And I see this so many times when we're talking about autistic young people, those neurodivergent young people who are out of education, who have had so much school-based trauma. It is absolutely shocking. The families are all traumatized by what they've experienced within schools. And then county will come up and they might say, yeah, absolutely, you can have an EOTAS package or you can have some kind of a different kind of educational package. And they'll say something and then they'll start the process. And then all of the power will be stripped from the parents again. So it's like they kind of dip in and dip out and dip in. And it's akin to kind of nearly emotional abuse within a system where you've got kind of a lot of gaslighting going on. We'll say this, we'll promise this, promise this, promise this, blank. We stonewall. Then we hear nothing. Then they kind of breadcrumb you. Yes, 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 nothing. And then they're saying, no, we didn't say that. We didn't say that. That's not what we said. This is not, And I'm thinking about this kind of white paper, this white paper consultation that's coming out right now. Okay, we're all in this middle of, oh my goodness, can we say the right things in this consultation, this public consultation, that the government will actually hear what we're trying to say? How much do we need to bleed on the computer? Can we send just a vial of our own blood into the government to show them what it has taken for people to get to where they're at in certain education settings and certain education experiences for young people and families and those who've been through it? And I just feel like this is a beautiful example of where the government are saying, you have the power to influence this white paper,
Mm.
Do we really?
Yeah.
Like, is that actually there? Because what they're saying in essence, the kind of that strap line is, yeah, absolutely. There's going to be so much more autonomy for kids. There's going to be so much more kind of individualized thinking. There's going to be so much more tailored support, blah, 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 blah. But they have to be within these three categories.
Yeah. And it's just like a bunch of the consultation itself is kind of intimidating, isn't it? There's like something like 40 odd, like just open text fields. It's the way that they always do them. And everybody now must be
That's
just like
powerful.
using,
That's power. That's how you don't get the answers that you don't want to
right.
hear, because it's inaccessible.
Yeah.
If you really wanted to hear what people had to say, you wouldn't give it in that format. You wouldn't give a certain amount of time.
Yeah.
This idea of kind of slice teams, where's the slice team when it comes to really thinking about this work?
Yeah. And it's not transparent, is it? It's like, so going back to we had a couple of the reviewers from the curriculum and assessment review on a while ago, and they were like headhunted. First of all, they were sort of tapped on the shoulder, and they weren't paid, which was interesting. So they were sort of had to be people who were in a position where they could, sort of go on quite a lengthy sabbatical from their main job to undertake this work. And so there was this interesting sort of power or lack of transparency there. And then like you could do so, like there's a thing called thematic analysis where like the amount of text that they must have been subjected to would be vast. And I imagine that everybody's just using AI at both ends of that process, right? Like AI come up with a bunch of stuff I can type into these 40 fields, and then they'll be using it at the other end. I'll have this vast pointless text corpus full of hallucinations and maybe some useful points as well. But you could do a thematic analysis and do a sort of a bottom-up account of that data, and that could be used in a transparent way, where they would say, "This is what you were telling us, and this is how we're going to act on what you said." And
Yeah.
like I heard a lovely example of I did some work recently about mattering. Like it's like people are talking a lot about belonging at the moment, belonging in schools. That Ofsted are sort of partly driving, and belonging is a bit of a phantom. Like belonging is an outcome of something much deeper.
I read a paper on that idea of mattering, right?
Yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah.
And as an example, my colleague Tara was saying that a school that she works with, the head teacher just sends out a little survey every Friday, has 2 questions on it. It's just like, how was your week on a 0 from 1 to 10? It's like, is there anything that I need to know? That's it. And then on the Monday morning in the briefing, she reads them over the weekend, and on the Monday morning she responds to them. And she's like, here's what I heard, and here's, like, so people just felt like they were connected to the decision making in a very simple way. And it wouldn't be hard for that to happen, but so often those consultations, as you say, the big listen that Ofsted did in the wake of the Ruth Perry thing, and then they had a big long dark night of the soul, and then came back with a rating. They said we're getting rid of gradings, and then they came back with just the same the same exact thing with a fake mustache on, basically. Yeah. And that's really disempowering, right? People sort of stop trying after a while because you're like, oh, I'm not going to fill out this consultation now because you're not going to listen anyway. And so it's really quite insidious, isn't it? Like when you get to that point where those relationships have broken down. And so let's bring it back to staff in schools and psychological safety. Have you seen any examples of like what does good look like?
I have.
Yeah, go on.
Well, I think we've talked about that's how we kind of got in touch with each other, wasn't it? Through Tina Farr.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah, so Tina and Claire at their school, they do some incredible work around ensuring that their team. I think one of the things that really struck me was they had done all this work for their kids right across the school, how to make the school way more accessible. They use Opal, they had all these incredible learning schemes. And then they walked into the staff room and were like, oh my God, this place is a shit show. It was disgusting. So what they did was they made the staff room a really nice, inviting place. They had different sections. They had places for people who didn't want to talk to other staff members, who could just kind of sit there and zone out during their break. There was a table where people could sit and kind of have their joint time together. There's another place where people can go and do some work, and there was always tea and coffee. There was never this idea, well, we used all the milk yesterday, so there's no fresh milk today. Or, there was never this kind of idea of, it always felt there was like abundance in terms of access to support and mattering, an abundance of mattering, that actually you do matter as a member of this team, no matter where you sit, stand, when you come in, when you leave, what your role is. And I think that was a big one. There's another couple of schools we work with, and within our organization, one of the things is we use a lot of kind of supervision. I've been thinking about this a lot, actually, about proper supervision for teams at schools. I'm as a music therapist, you're not allowed to be a music therapist without supervision. I've been paying for my own supervision, even though I haven't been working clinically. I've been paying for it for about 7, 8 years because I believe in it. I believe in any of the work I do. I need a space to be able to reflect on the impact it's having on me and also my practice. So for me, a really good idea of kind of that idea of mattering and kind of balance of power shows good reflexivity. So where somebody's able to, something will happen and then they'll be curious about what's happened, why they responded in a certain way. Then they'll go, oh, interesting. How am I going to change my practice going forward? So it's not always pushing something's happened onto somebody else. Not always. It's that kind of ability to be accountable and take responsibility for different areas. And you may not have had anything to do with the actual incident or one particular thing. So, a year 4 class teaching an English lesson and something happens over there. Within a system, if you think of a pipe system, like a plumbing system within a house, your bathroom tap might not work or the pressure might be gone, but it could be because there's a leak in the attic, right? Lots of people do a lot of work on the tap. They change the tap. They might change something in the boiler and up pressure. They might do all of this different stuff, but they've never actually looked at the real leak, which is right up in the attic. So it's about just taking a step back and looking at the whole system and seeing how can we be curious about this and seeing where these kind of pockets of not mattering, these pockets of people feeling powerless matter to the day. And I think if staff can feel like they matter, that they have a voice, that they feel psychologically safe to challenge, to be curious about things, to ask why, why are we doing that? What's the point? And actually saying, I don't really agree with that, or I don't understand it enough to be able to agree to it. I'd like to know more. Can I be involved in that, please? And then being invited in to do that. That's a big deal. Can you imagine in just a regular secondary school, someone coming up to a head teacher or like even the lead of a trust, right? Coming up and saying, I'm not sure why you're doing that. I'm not sure I can agree to it. I'd really like to be involved in the process of it so I can understand it more. So then actually I can embed it and I can practice it and I can be reflexive and reflective at the same time and this impacts practice, right? And if you've got a teacher who's feeling like that, you're going to have students feeling like that. I walked into a classroom the other day and kids were sitting in a circle at the top of the classroom in a very small space. Okay. They're a wobbly classroom anyway. They're very jiggly. They're all sitting in a circle. One child is literally sitting on another child's head, right? And the teacher's like, I'm going to call some parents in to look at your behavior. And I was just like, dude, I have no power here. Because I said to her, what do you think is going to happen if you call me in to look at these children? I'm a mum of a child in that class. I want to go in as a support, not as a kind of you should be doing something better. Don't give me that. That's not on me. And that's about her practice and how she feels like she has enough autonomy and enough agency and enough, I suppose, I don't know. I don't think she feels like she can impact at that point. And then there's one child sitting at the back of the class at their table because he's not allowed to sit on the carpet because he's too difficult. And I was just like, oh my God, if I could map this right now and just take an hour with this teacher, this class, and this system, we could completely tweak how we view how these kids are functioning, how the teacher is functioning, and then how that functions within the wider system.
I love the way you keep coming back to the importance of reflection.
Oh, it's massive.
And there's a wonderful quote from somebody whom I can't remember, that give me somebody who's prepared to reflect on their practice and I'll give you a teacher regardless of their subject knowledge and any other particular strength. And I'm intrigued as to how that sits now within a system that seems to me to be obsessed with accountability. So, for people like Tina Farr, there's a courage involved
Mhm.
in going out in the way that she does because there's an implicit model that's in the minds of Ofsted. Hence people can write a book on how to teach the perfect Ofsted lesson or, how to get the perfect Ofsted report and all of that. So we've had a culture of accountability, particularly in English education, for a long time now. In a sense, what we're doing in this conversation is asking people to exercise autonomy. We're asking them to hold up the mirror to their own practice. We're asking them to look at their own behaviours. How challenging is that within that established culture of accountability?
Oh my goodness. Well, it's terrifying, isn't it? Absolutely terrifying if you think about it, because what we're being asked to do is to be accountable, this whole accountability model down from Ofsted and everything. But nobody, I'm wondering who, I'm really curious actually about who in Ofsted will be looking about their practice. Yeah. I think it's great that we're always asking teachers to be accountable, think about their practice. And I think, again, it goes across, if we're teaching this, if we're asking teachers to be reflexive and to be reflective on their practice, we also need to teach this to children to be reflexive and reflective on their own experience, right? Which means then they need to be allowed to say how they feel and to disagree, which then challenges everything that we've set up as a system that it sits currently, because there is no space for people to be curious and to ask about difference and to include difference. And it goes back to that intersectionality model, right? If we think about intersectionality within John Burnham, this chap I talked about right at the beginning for my master's, he wrote this thing about graces, which is it's an acronym, a very, very long acronym based on GGRRRAACCEEEESS, and it's like it's based on it's about
That is not an acronym. That's
well,
a
it's not
code.
really, is it? It's
That's
yeah,
a code.
I love
it's
how
brilliant.
so many tortured acronyms there are in
Mate.
academia. They can never quite make it work. There's always like a little A or something. It's hilarious.
So it's
Yeah,
only
so
it's only an acronym if you can actually say it. You
that's
cannot
it. Well,
say
you can
go go
remember
go
how
go
many
go
A's.
go.
Yeah,
Don't
yeah,
you
yeah,
want?
absolutely. But he talks about kind of geography and so all the letters stand for something like geography, gender, and then you've got race, religion, and then you've got C would be, I don't know, I can't even remember, this is awful. And then you've got like education's in there, you've got sexuality, you've got uh anyway, you can imagine it. It's a whole range of ideas that everybody comes with their own kind of tapestry of experience. And then you kind of pop all of these young people together in a room. And no one talks about any of these differences, by the way. We all just stick them into a room and say, right, you're 2B, you're 6J,
Or
you're
not to
Willow.
be.
Yeah, there you go. Or not to be. Nice to see it. Or you're Willow class, or you're this class, or you're, whatever it is. And you're all stuck in a room. And then this teacher comes in with all their own stuff, which isn't named or talked about kind of stories that are untold, the stories that are untellable, stories that aren't being digested. And then all of that becomes this kind of big soup, which is also within a system of a head teacher who comes in and a senior leadership team who also have their own stuff and their own ideas about, and I think what education tried to do was try to put so many structure bits in place and so many kind of frameworks in place is to make that work, right? To say, right, we need to teach these kids things so they can leave school and go and sit for 17 hours in a factory and work on a factory line and make a living and be able to bring that. That has changed. Difference now. We are talking, when I grew up in Ireland, everybody in my class was white and Irish. You go back to Dublin now, that is not the case. The world is different. And within that difference comes people's different experiences. Within that comes a huge range of knowledge and nuance and the wealth. Like, it's so glorious if we're able to take all of this in and actually use it to build on what we've already got. It's game changer, but it does take people being willing, like Tina Farr, to stick her head above the parapet, but she'll never stick her head up and say, I know what we need to do. She'll stick her head up and say, I'm really interested as to why that happened. I'd like to have a conversation about it. And I think we're always looking for what's the next fix. You know, you'll have someone coming, this is a brilliant, like my bloody children's phonics programs change every 2 years because this is the one that's going to work. This is the one that's going to make phonics work for every child. And it's not, okay? Just putting it out there because we have 30 different brains trying to work in a classroom. So, and again, it's that power. Who decided that this phonics thing was going to be changed? And then the English lead, the literacy lead for early years in Key Stage 1 gets this new phonic program that the school have bought into. You know, have they been consulted? Have they thought about it? And then the teachers are then introduced to it and said, let's teach this. And then the children are never said, kind of explain to them why we have. Can you see just where these kind of, within systemic stuff, there's this kind of CMM stuff. Do you know about CMM as well?
No.
Oh, CMM is brilliant. It's like communication management of meaning. And it's about all of these different layers. So there might be a tiny little action that you see, or someone might say a word, and then that leads to something else. And then that leads to something this. And so it goes from kind of those bigger kind of macro, whatever the biggest one is, all the way down to the kind of micro. So it can happen right up here and impact right down here, or happen down here and impact up there. But it's about following those journeys. And I think within power, we ignore all of that. And we say, right, this is what it is, do it. Or you have the little kid who's jumped over the fence and the whole school kind of goes to shit. This is what it is. And then it all falls apart.
Yeah.
And that's what we're seeing in the white paper. You know, they're saying, what needs to change, everybody? And everybody goes, these are our experiences. And then they come out, right, this is it. Consult on this. And they're like, how can we consult on this when actually there's been no transparency about how this was written?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's guided by the questions that they ask, right? There's like, yeah.
Like if I went to the questions the other day and I was looking at them, I can't, it's massive. I went through a couple of questions, I was thinking, gosh, I would have asked the question in a different way. Because they're asking questions because they want an answer in a certain way.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. To often to meet what they've already decided.
Yeah.
I'm learning such a lot from this. I've got Schwartz rounds. I've got John Burnham and his social graces model. I've got CMM. Thank you. I'm adding to my stockpile. So just like thinking, let's think about the student level now, or the child level. There's a question. So like, I worked at a place in Brighton, which was really interesting for a few years, called the Self-Managed Learning College.
Oh, yeah.
It's now no longer exists, but it basically does exist. Like the tutors set up another place that's very similar to it, so it's still still there, and it's very student led. It's self-directed, right? So the kids do what they want when they want for as long as they want. The tutors we used to run sessions, but the kids can just choose not to go to that if they don't want, and they can do their own thing. And they had a lot of power in that space, and it was really interesting. It was like half the time I would come home saying, this is just so amazing, like everywhere, this is how everything needs to run. And the other time I'd come home saying, this place should be shut down. This is not okay. Like there's so much discomfort that happens when especially when I went in there bowling in there with my sort of, having been a secondary school teacher, which is very sort of a top down, very just by its nature, even sort of progressive secondary schools, things that are a bit more progressive, it's still essentially an authoritarian model, right? Of just like the teacher's right and the teacher knows best and what have you, and they set the agenda. And so I suppose a question is like, is it even possible to have healthy power dynamics in a large secondary school type environment, given the sheer volume of people that there are in those buildings? It just seems like it's you hear lots of unhealthy examples. There's lots of all this like super disciplinarian stuff, kids getting put in detention for the slightest thing. All that stuff we don't need to rehearse, but we hear lots of sort of unhealthy dynamics, and they're playing out at the teacher level as well. That teachers don't have a voice, that they're not able to influence decisions, that they're not encouraged to ask questions. They just have to sort of suck it up as well. It feels like the power dynamics in schools are really unhealthy to me, often, especially in secondary schools. So I guess my
I
question
think
would
they're
be like,
equally, I
is
think they're
it
equally difficult in both, but I think it's easier to not see it in younger kids' schools because it's a really interesting question, actually.
okay?
Yeah.
I mean,
But
one
I know what you mean. I think within secondary schools, I think there is a chance. I think there absolutely is a way to begin thinking about this differently and to do something different. But I think it just needs to be talked about because it's just not talked about.
mm,
Can you imagine if at the beginning of a year, right, the first assembly that was done, you offered young people, you say, right, it's a school assembly, right, you can access it from the classroom virtually, you can come into the hall and access it, or you can access it from the library. That's how we're going to start this year. You do not have to come into the hall for this assembly. And this assembly is on power. Okay. And we're going to introduce everybody on this team. And everybody on this team, we're going to spend a little bit of time. This is what it's going to look like. We're going to tell the kids in advance what the agenda is for the assembly. Yeah. We're going to get every single staff member to have written a little profile about who they are and what their special interests are and what they're interested in, and humanize those staff members. And straight away, you have shifted the power dynamic within that school, like irreparably. Because what you've done is you've begun a relational journey. Like, how many times does a kid know that the English teacher actually is mad into anime? You don't. But
yeah,
that could actually change a kid's life. If you had a kid who really struggles to go into literacy or goes into English, right? But is mad into anime, and suddenly they know that that English teacher is mad into anime too, that child will go, oh, hold on a second. And it could just start some kind of ever so slight spark. So that child will be able to access that classroom because they are no longer a non-human and a non-human. Because that's what I'm seeing. I'm seeing teachers who are seen as non-humans and children who are seen as non-humans, and all trying to exist in this same space without anybody actually touching each other, without anybody really connecting. And I think if we could do that, I think slight, tiny shifts. And there's this, it's about risk, isn't it? It's about taking a risk. It's about taking a risk of saying, I'm willing to, like within, if we think about therapeutic work, within kind of analysis, that kind of real strong kind of Freudian kind of Jungian analysis, the therapist doesn't share anything about themselves. Within systemic stuff, your lived experience, like the conference this year in systemic, is Come As You Are. It's all about lived experience, living experience. How do we as therapists, how do we as teachers, how do we as humans, how do we as students bring our stories into where we work and use them to help the work we do, inform our practice rather than shut it off? And that's what we're asking our kids to do. We're asking our kids to come in and forget about the rest of their lives, to learn and then go home. And I think there's too much of that. And that for me is a lot around control, around power over rather than power with.
mm,
And that, I think, is central to a lot of our thinking. I mean, a couple of things that I wanted to raise with you. One is that I was speaking to somebody yesterday who's been involved in a 4-day course that Fife Council are providing right across the board now, I think, called Daring Ventures. And it's a woman, Suzanne Zedek, a developmental psychologist, who's running the course. And it's about getting people to understand the principles of relationships and getting them to better understand themselves. And consistently, people who've been in that course talk about it as being transformative. And they talk about how powerful it has been that they've learned to know themselves and understand their own behaviour and therefore are capable of modifying. And it builds a confidence and a
Yep.
security and all of that. And they've got, interestingly, a couple of secondary schools who've really taken on that course. They've sent large numbers of staff to it in relative terms, and they're doing transformational work within the schools subsequently. Is that the kind of transition we need to make, Dee?
Yep. Yes, we need to start seeing schools as not somewhere where someone walks in, learns something, and walks out. This isn't a transactional thing. It's not I go into a shop, I buy a packet of biscuits, and I walk out. That is not a relation experience. Okay, yeah, you might have a chat with the shopkeeper. You can make it a very different one, but you can just walk in, buy the biscuits, walk out. School is not like that. The amount of time our young people spend at school, the amount of time teachers spend at school, it is absolutely massive. And if we're not willing to bring in that whole human into that setting, then what we're doing is we're controlling what comes in and what comes out. And then we're expecting people to have this amazing experience and then being able to kind of reach young people and ensure that there isn't burnout within the teaching profession. Of course, there's going to be burnout because if you have to go in and you have to kind of, in one sense, I'm going to use the word masking, not in relation to the autistic experience, but as an autistic someone who masked for a very long time, it is and I was a teacher, so I stopped teaching. I could not teach. I walked into a classroom. I saw the one in the corner. And I was like, right, that guy is cool, and I get his brain and whatever else. And I ended up teaching to him, but I taught in a way that could engage this young lad, and everybody else came with me because it was meaningful and relational and helpful. So I worked with the one that really needed that bit of change. But it was just better for everybody in the end. But that whole system, I couldn't work within it because it just wasn't, interestingly, I was autistic. It wasn't flexible enough for me. And people talk about autistic people being inflexible. Absolutely opposite. And I'm also hyper empathic. So that idea of not being able to be relational within a setting just drained me, utterly drained me. I was thinking about this the other day. So lots of young people go into schools and having had left a dad because they swap over houses, right? So they might swap over houses on a Friday or a Tuesday or whatever day. And I was thinking, God, wouldn't it be amazing if the first thing you did in the morning, you came in and you sat down with your teacher and you'd all had a cup of tea and a biscuit and chatted about your morning. That was the first bit of the day. Yeah. And then you started the learning.
Yeah.
And the teacher said, oh my goodness, you won't believe what happened to me this morning. My puppy puked all over the carpet, my favorite carpet, but and lots of time those little things happen during the day and they tend to happen earlier on in early years. And then as our children grow, we expect them to be less relational, whereas actually we need to teach more of that so as they don't become so rigid and feel like they have to protect. Because if we have constant power coming in, we are going to go into protect mode. Sorry, David.
No, I just wanted to throw an interesting challenge because you talked about how powerful would it be if young people knew that their English teacher was obsessed with anime. What happens if he's obsessed with misogynistic practices? What happens if he's obsessed with Nietzsche? What happens if he spends his spare time listening to, I don't know, GB News? What there are some really interesting issues, aren't there, around who should be with children, obviously. And
we don't ask the question, do we? We don't ask that question. If he's teaching in a school and no one knows that for me is a school that is not psychologically safe. That is not a place where people can ask uncomfortable questions and take those risks. Yeah. Okay. And we have to. And I will say this here, we have to start asking and being comfortable with that uncomfortableness. Like I always talk about within my team, whenever we have discussions, and clear is kind. Right? If there's something going on, please just tell us straight away, because clear is kind, unclear is unkind. Because if we don't know what's going on, we can't do anything to impact it or to make a difference or whatever else. And lots of times we have found ourselves in positions where we try to fix something before we know the problem, because we're thinking, oh, well, we know, so no, we don't know. So we have to go in with curiosity rather than, and it'd be surprising how many times we go in and then realize what we thought was going on is actually not what was going on. And we just had this idea of this is what it is, and then just having that curiosity. But I think there's something about without discomfort, there will be no change. If we're not willing to sit with discomfort, change cannot happen. We talk about safe spaces and brave safe spaces. A safe space is great. Yeah, I like safe spaces when I need a safe space and I don't need anyone to kind of ask me to be anywhere outside of my safety zone and feel like I need to do anything. It's very important for me. A brave safe space is a space where people feel safe enough to be brave. And that for me is an ideal learning environment.
And is there a threshold then around people's traits, personalities, their habits, their interests, in terms of who gets into the classroom? Because you're absolutely right at the moment. The staffing situation is if somebody can teach business studies and they've got a pulse, they're in. And I mean, what are the implications of what you're saying in terms of who is working with children?
Well, for me, it comes down to safeguarding both that the children, obviously really, really important, but also safeguarding that person, right? Because if we're asking someone to come in and they have a pulse and they can teach business, but actually what they're doing is they're kind of really hard line anti-Semitic, or they're really hardline racist, in their kind of private life. What we're not creating a space, then we are not doing due diligence on those coming into the profession. And if we're seeing that actually, like, I'm really curious about how something like that might not be obvious, like how something like that could be hidden. And if it is being hidden, that for me is a power problem in itself, because those who have that power aren't using it in a way that's helpful.
I offer you the Edinburgh Academy inquiry. I offer you I offer you the Scottish child abuse inquiry. I offer you the experience that lots of people in the organisation seen and heard will talk about, particularly in the private sector. But I think we all know there are similar problems. I think there's something really challenging about the scale of what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
And slightly lighter note. When I started as a director, I felt I should seriously up my game from the fairly ragtaggle, anarchic person that I truly was, and I should behave somewhat more like a director. And I attempted to purchase Gravitas online without much success. And then I realised that it wasn't working for me. And I said to my leadership team, I said, look, I've been trying this role-playing thing as director. It's really not working for me. I'm going to start bringing my personality to work. And the immediate response was,
Thank God.
David, not all of it.
Brilliant. If you can just keep some at the door, that'd be great.
Yeah.
Let's rethink education.
Hello, everybody. I will keep this short and sweet, so no need to reach for that skip button. We love making this podcast, and with over 600,000 episodes downloaded to date, it seems like people out there are enjoying it too. In fact, we even hear from people from time to time. It is a labour of love, though, with the emphasis on both the love and the labour. Producing each episode involves reading books, carrying out the interviews, obviously editing them, paying for the increasingly bewildering array of tools that keep a show like this running. Most people don't realize, but podcasts like this rely on support from people like yourselves. Right now, we have 27 patrons who help us to keep this show going. If just 1% of our listeners joined them at patreon.com/repod, we could sustainably create even more of these amazing conversations, which I think are increasingly urgent. There are various tiers to choose from with different benefits attached to each tier, starting from as little as the price of a cup of coffee or herbal tea per month. Or if you prefer to make a one-off donation, you can do so at buymeacoffee.com/repod. Either way, if you just want to carry on listening, please feel free to do so. And thank you very much for being part of this community. Now let's get back to today's episode.
But there is something in that, isn't there?
Yeah, but
I mean,
again, it's, oh gosh, it's that kind of thinking, isn't it? It's that, again, it's that curiosity. It's that idea of someone will come up with an idea and they'll go, yeah, that's a great idea. Let's do that, without any thought about, you know, or I am in this particular position, so I need to be this kind of person. I need to be speaking in this certain way. Like, I have worked really hard to build and to understand who I am in relation to what I do and how I work and all of that. And I am known now, kind of within the circles that I work in, to be someone who will happily say, people invite me to a meeting if they want something to be said that people struggle to talk about, because it will just start a nice conversation, an interesting conversation, and lots of times it will end the meeting because people have come to speak about something, and then actually what needs to be spoken about can't be spoken about at that point because we don't have the right people in the room. So we have all of these constant meetings, right? And that, for me, that feels a little bit like when we're trying to teach young people and we just don't have the right people in the room. If you have someone in that room who isn't committed to teaching children, who isn't committed to understanding that they are autonomous, that they should have agency, that they have separate brains from their own, it's like kind of parenting plus, isn't it? You know, as parents, we're told old parenting styles was about control. My children should be able to, I should be able to kind of control what my children are doing. God, you know, that's a huge fallacy. They are separate human beings to me. The work I do, I give you, I use this analogy of carrying a carton of milk, a very, very big thing of milk, right? But it's leaking slightly. And as a parent or as a professional or whatever, as a teacher, I give it to my child to carry because I'm not able to own it. I'm not able to say that that's my milk. And it kind of spills on them now and then. But because it's milk, it dries and you can't see it. And then they carry it around, and then they have to kind of put it down to do things. So there's always something to think about. And then eventually they start to smell because milk goes off, right? And they start being the problem. They smell, they don't do this, da, 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 da. Whereas actually, as a different human being, I hold my own big thing of milk, and I need to work out why there's so much milk in it, get rid of some, find a different container, you know, make it more manageable for me so I don't put that on someone else.
And would that be the milk of human kindness?
Oh, I think if you can be anything, be kind. I believe
you're talking about your baggage, essentially, the things that you're carrying in
I'm talking about
you're carrying with you.
Yes, you're human, your lived experience, your experience as a human. And we don't think about that. We don't think about, and it's kind of, it smacks of that idea that, you know, a teacher is more important than the child. You know, how that teacher kind of comes in, but then they don't feel like they're more important than the child because they feel completely out of control. They feel completely disempowered because of the system. But those children are looking at that teacher going, oh my goodness, you know, she's amazing, he's amazing, he's this, she's that, blah, 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 blah. And it's that real constant conflict between whose voice can be heard, whose ideas are important, and how do we share that space. And it gets harder as you get secondary because obviously children have more language, they have more ability to express themselves, they have more, meant to have more autonomy, they don't, but
and the teachers just know them so much less because, you know, they're seeing them for like 1 or 2 or 3 hours a week instead of, you know, 25 hours a week.
Yeah.
I mean, to go back to what you were talking about earlier, you were talking about sort of like creating spaces within schools for people to connect right?
Yeah.
And just to talk about, you used the example of anime, and without wanting to go back over that, like David's challenge, like of course there are concerns that can arise, and the safeguarding procedures that can be in place for when certain things arise. But I think that there's a really strong case for doing what you talk about, and I know Tina's been name checked a lot in this conversation, but the amazing thing that they do at Tina's school at St. Ebbs in Oxford, where they have music playing in the morning in the playground at drop off, and the parents and the staff are all out there, and the kids are all dancing. It's just like a no-brainer. Like, why would you not do that? It's such a joyful way to start the day. It's absolutely beautiful, and I advocate the use of these like meaning-making lessons. So just to have a lesson, one lesson a week, and it's essentially quite similar to P4C, to like philosophical inquiry, but that can often still be done in quite a teacher-led way. But it's essentially a circle time session where we just have like an open forum, and it's like, let's just talk about what's going on. And like you can have a suggestion box. There's all kinds of ways you can organize it, but all of this stuff, all of this confusing stuff, these ideas that populate our lives. You mentioned things like intersectionality earlier, or David mentioned misogyny. There's probably 10 things that have come up in this conversation. You mentioned like class and race and religion and stuff in that Grace's model. You could talk about what's happening in the news. Like, everybody's really struggling to sort of to keep up, to just keep their head afloat. There's just so much sort of chaos happening. The manosphere stuff that's been in the news recently because of the documentary. There are so many issues. Technology use. How can we learn how to live alongside this technology? Like, just banning it from schools is not solving the problem. It's just like moving the milk elsewhere, and it's exploding. The kids are on their phones for 8 hours a night on a weeknight. That's not how to fix that problem. And so just like finding time and space, carving out time and space within the school day to have moments of informal, like unplanned human interaction, I think is.
It's about connection.
Right. Yeah.
It's about connection. And if you talk about, Brene Brown talks about the near enemy and the far enemy. It's like a Buddhist kind of idea, but there's a near enemy and far enemy of kind of addiction. And it's the near enemy of addiction is disconnection, right? This idea that we seek to get ourselves kind of addicted. We're in something, we're completely numbing ourselves because we're disconnected. That disconnection comes from feeling like we don't matter because we haven't been kind of given ways of belonging. And like, I'm thinking about and I think this idea of circle time, and you say that in secondary schools, and they all kind of go, oh, circle time. Forget about it.
They love it though. After
they
that initial
absolutely
hump, they love it.
Oh my God, it's like life changing. But it's just, so I think about a young lad there the other day. My daughter was parking her bike, and she said, oh, blah, 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 so-and-so's mummy's going to have another baby. And I was like, and I was thinking that moment, I was like, that mother is not having another child. I'm telling you right now, she is not anywhere near having another child ever in her life, ever again, right? I didn't say that. That was in my head. And I said, oh, that's really interesting. I'm wondering why he said that. I tell you what, why don't you go in and you say, oh, do you really want a little baby, a brother or sister? What would that mean? And then I kind of met the mum, and the mum laughed at me, and then she started to cry practically. She was like, absolutely not after this young lad. And but it was very interesting because what he was trying to do was start a conversation. He was trying to engage people with something, but his way of doing it was just to tell a lie. So it came across, then the teacher was saying to him that he was lying to people. And I was like, oh my goodness, he's not lying. His experience of how he tells things at that time in his life is that he said a statement, and actually it's up to us as the grown-ups to be curious about it.
Yeah, he's connecting.
But he's trying to connect. And I think a lot of our young people, especially in secondary schools, will connect like that young lad, right, David? You talk about at the back of the class, when he said, oh, how long have you known? That was a kind of a fishing rod of, I'm looking to connect with you because you see us. You actually see us, David, and I'm willing to kind of be slightly vulnerable with you because I can. And I think that power of vulnerability, and when people say vulnerable, I'm not talking about, again, just weeping all over people. I'm just talking about that human connectedness, that ability to be able to say, I am interested in what you said, and I'm curious about what you said, and what you say matters.
Yeah.
And I am so interested in what you're saying. And I think what we've done predictably is we've stumbled into such a rich conversation that's had so many possible implications. I think what we've managed to do is we've managed to get to some of the really key elements around connection, around curiosity, around openness, which have been, I think, fundamental to a number of conversations that we've had on the podcast. But I think you've taken it to a remarkable level, Dee. And sadly, we're not, I think, doing that conversation justice. And I think what we maybe need to do is round it up on that final set of comments from you, just about that power of connection. And I loved your contrast between connection and addiction. I love that idea of addiction being the cover for the absence of connection. And there are so many elements in that, it ties back into classic Marxist concepts around alienation, but extending it to a personal level rather than just a social level in that sense. So it's so much that I think we can come back to. But for me, this has been just such a rich and powerful and very, very open conversation. And I'm so grateful to you for leading us through it.
Oh, I feel
Thank you.
privileged. It's just brilliant. I love it. I absolutely love it.
Likewise, it's really lovely to connect with you. Should we wrap up with that other
Yeah.
question, David? So recently, with your hat on, with your autistic
Here it
champions
comes. Here
hat
it
on,
comes.
here it comes, the hand grenade incoming. So recently there was this what would you call it? So Uta Frith did a few interviews, I think.
Yeah.
Probably the preeminent researcher, is that fair to say, of autism for the last few decades, or certainly one of them. And the test headline was that she doesn't believe that autism is a spectrum anymore. And she talks about two groups essentially within people with an autism diagnosis, children who are diagnosed quite young, sort of 3 to 5 years old, who have particular sort of behaviors or restricted behaviors is the language that she's using. And then there's people who tend to be diagnosed a bit later on in sort of adolescence. And she was sort of saying that group is the group that's expanding really rapidly. The number of autism diagnoses has risen a lot in recent years in that group in particular. And she was sort of suggesting that maybe we're talking about two different things here. She also suggests at one point that there might be two different sort of genetic drivers of these two different sets of characteristics that we see. I don't know if you have anything to add to this, David. I know you've done probably a bit more reading around this than I do. Before we lob it over to you, Dee, to see what you make of all of this.
I don't think we need any more explosives in this grenade. I think it's fine just as it is.
Okay, what's your take on it?
All right. So there's loads of different perspectives that I kind of come at it from an autistic person. I think having watched the journey of what it means for people to get a diagnosis and to be seen is life-changing for a lot of people. And for someone to come out and just kind of say, well, it's not really real, or it's like that really hit the autistic community very, very hard. It was quite devastating, actually. I think a lot of people felt like, again, people's lived experience was just kind of in a very unnuanced way, was kind of just with this headline, there's no real spectrum anymore. It's like, and we don't, there's been a whole load of genetic research. We did the whole, that 10K thing from Autistica, they had to stop doing because people thought about eugenics and why they're interested in people's genetic composition because they're autistic. And, it's a minefield. I think for me, the timing of it just blew my mind. That the white paper,
SCND review ongoing
paper, and then because I don't know if you know, but the Naomi Fisher podcast was actually recorded ages ago. Yeah, that wasn't recorded and then kind of released. It was so I think the timing of it, and I'm just very curious about how that message that, not everybody needs a diagnosis, or they're not really properly autistic enough. You know what I mean? Or what does it mean to be someone who's been diagnosed later on in life, or someone who's been diagnosed in secondary, or someone who has more spoken language than those who don't have spoken language. And it does also get into this area, which I'm really interested in, is working with those who are non-speakers, because a lot of non-speakers are incredibly capable, but are seen as not capable because they don't have that spoken language, and actually are in schools bored out of their brains because what's on offer to them isn't meeting their needs in terms of what they're capable of. And I think it's so nuanced that I was really disappointed that that was the strap line that came across from Tess. I think these kind of conversations, and Uta Frith, like the work she's done across the years, so much respect for her as a professional. I think we know now that there are there was a few things in there that really made me uncomfortable about the idea that there's not enough research done into camouflaging and masking. There is an incredible amount of research. There's now even a diagnostic tool to rate masking, the CAT-Q. So that is a known kind of a used tool. She talked about the idea of sensory processing, and there's not enough kind of that. Just because a child needs it, we shouldn't give it to them because it might not be good for them. Like a child might need headphones, and she talked about the idea that should that person just not learn to live with it rather than giving them, because it might not be good for them to give them something to reduce that noise. And it just made me feel very uncomfortable with the what I've seen and how we have worked to put things in place for a young person or even a young adult, and how life-changing it is when those tiny little changes and those tiny little sensory differences can be acknowledged and named and understood and accepted, huge word, accepted by the school and the team and all of that. Those children's lives can be completely different. And yet then we have someone like Uta Frith coming out and speaking so broadly that those who want to hear it and who are waiting for this idea that there's too many diagnoses, there's too much of this, there's too much of this. This could just be that we are now in a place where we finally realize that the system that we put together back in just after World War II, where education became this thing, and it was all of that. And, we are still talking about a system that is not currently fit for what we have in schools. Life has changed dramatically, even the past 10 years, right? In how we teach. Like when I was teaching originally, I had a blackboard and chalk, and the kids had notebooks, right? They had their English book, which we taught out of, and their maths book. And I'm Irish, I understand that. So we are obviously completely different now, and we're kind of slightly ahead of lots of other different places. But if you think about now, we have a whiteboard, we have that independent whiteboard stuff. We have the thing that we can draw on. We have AI. The world is a completely different place. And it might have been that actually all these sensory things weren't seen earlier because they just weren't there. You go in, I always give the example of, you go into a supermarket now. How many types of toilet roll is there? 463, right? How many types of cereal is there? Oh my goodness. When I was growing up, we had like 3 types of toilet roll. The kind of posh one, the not so posh one, and then the one you definitely didn't want to use because it was the sandpaper stuff, that didn't actually pick up anything really.
Yes.
Stuff that was in the schools. So the life has changed, and I think it's really difficult to come in and say that there's no longer a spectrum, that these people might not be autistic, and then not leave space for people to really have a conversation about this before putting a statement like that out there.
Yeah, I can see it's been done in quite an inflammatory way, and of course, there's like a sub editor who's trying to
the timing, but also Uta Frith in the test. Why was she in the Times Educational Supplement? The Guardian, maybe I'd understand, but why at that time, just after the white paper came out, was that? That for me is just, that's what I'm interested in.
It's interesting.
And how then impacts how that's seen and how that's read. And
yeah. It's interesting. There seems to be this common sort of belief, and politicians say it from time to time that there's like that this has all got out of control and that it's all being overdiagnosed. But the conversations that I've had with people in healthcare is like, if anything, it's underdiagnosed. That
Underdiagnosed.
there's like the people are like they can't do enough to meet the demand that there is. I did have a conversation recently, and I'm a complete outsider here. I'm not. This is not my wheelhouse at all. But I have a friend who runs a center, a specialist center for autistic students at a local school, and we went for a coffee about a year ago, and she was sort of saying then that. She said that she finds it more helpful to think of it not so much as a spectrum as like a wheel with, there's those sort of like spider diagram type things. I don't know, is this like an accepted thing within? Can you explain
People
a bit?
don't think of a spectrum anymore as in a line because
Right.
actually we're not linear.
Well, there's different sort of features about sort of verbal communication, verbal, non-verbal, about emotional effect, and there's these different sort of dimensions. Is that correct?
So if we're thinking about let's think about that kind of that human aspect, that vulnerability, that kind of relational stuff. And I'll give you an example, a personal example, right? So as you can see, I'm very capable of expressing myself. I enjoy a conversation. I get very excited about this. So this for me would be slightly intellectually stimming, right? So I get very, very kind of this really piques my interest, and it really, and then what I'll do is I'll find myself getting very hyper focused on something, okay, or I'll find the opposite and I cannot get started on something. So that's that kind of executive function idea, where executive function can be quite affected by motivation, it can be affected by environment, it can be affected by topic, and it can be affected by kind of tiredness. And then what will happen is I will become non-verbal when I'm completely overwhelmed. So when I'm sensorially overwhelmed, or I'm completely exhausted, or I struggle, and people say autistic people aren't empathic. It's nearly the opposite, that we nearly feel everything and have to be very careful about how much we let in and how much we don't let in. And that can exhaust me to the point where I can become non-verbal and I can only write what I need to say. And I'll have to go under a dark room, weighted blanket, and that will be me for like 7 hours to be able to recover. And then you think of the sensory stuff. So there are days when I cannot wear certain types of clothes. So I might change my clothes 6 times because I actually physically cannot have them on my body, because I won't be able to think about anything else except for that. And then we expect, and that's kind of just part of kind of that nuanced idea of what it is to be in my body and my brain. And then you add in the ADHD type of thing, which is I love new, I love impulsive, I love that kind of sparkly, yay, dopamine, dopamine. And then my autistic side is like routine, please. I like routine, I like sameness. So it's this kind of constant conflict between the both. And I suppose it's again seeing that humanness, that intersectionality of all the different bits that comes alongside who it is that we are engaging with in front of us. And I think when we become stuck on this idea of, othering, it either is or it isn't. When we're definite about something, if we're definitely sure about something, we are the most unsure we've ever been. And I think when someone comes at me and says, oh, it's definitely this, straight away my body goes, okay, let's look for all the evidence that might be against that.
There's a wonderful coming together in this last section of two huge parts of today's conversation. And one of them is about the whole idea of seeing people who they are beyond any labels that we might put on them, and the argument for depth of understanding. And then there's the demand for classification and diagnosis on the other hand. And you've made a really powerful case for why that's so important. But there's that wonderful tension, isn't there, that if people had trust,
Yes.
and if people felt that they would be seen regardless of their label,
Yep.
then the discussion that we've just had and the intensity of that debate that we're having around the extent of diagnosis would be utterly irrelevant. And I think it's something that we're going to come back to, Dee. I'm really grateful to you for taking us there, because this has been ultimately a conversation about a change in culture.
It is.
And a real change in how we think. It's about a move to a different fundamental understanding of how we relate to one another and how we connect. And I'm very grateful to you for taking us there. But I think we're placing huge demands now on the stamina of our listeners. So I'm going to end it with a huge thank you to you and a huge thank you to James. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks, James. Thanks, David.
Thank you so much for joining us. It was great.
Okay.
Beautiful. Thank you, Dee.
No, fine. That was brilliant.
Yeah.
Are you standing, James?
Really interesting. I am I am standing, yeah.
Okay.
I'm
And who's behind you? Who's been running around behind you?
stander. Oh, this is the
But
dog. The dog is who's wearing a. I'm going to try and unblur my background, but it'll still be a bit blurry, I think. He's wearing.
He's wearing a coat.
He's wearing the cone of shame. I'm
The coat
afraid.
of shame.
Sorry, but now he's wagging his tail because he knows we're talking about him.
Oh, hello.
This is Dee.
Hi.
Oh, we've gone to wag speed 2.
Wow. Look
Yeah.
at that. What kind of dog is it? It's a Labrador.
There we go. Yeah, black lab.
Look
Yeah,
at
he's just got a little graze on his back leg that he keeps licking, so nothing bad. Anyway, yeah, well, that was lovely. Thank you so
It
much.
was amazing.
Would you like to review it? Is there any? Would you want to sort of like listen back and have a think? It will probably be two weeks or so before it comes out. We're just about to release one.
Yeah. I'm happy to. I'm pretty much sure it'll all be absolutely fine, to be honest with you. But
okay. Well, I'm happy to send it over, and let me know if there's anything.
Glaringly obvious. I do swear sometimes, so apologies. But I think one of you swore first, so then I decided.
Exactly. David often lowers the tone.
There you go, David. Good man. Good man.
And if there's any like links to anything that you want us to include in the show notes, feel free to send that over as well.
Yeah, just to me, just to us, to what we do.
Autism Champions.
Yeah, we just got our website, autismchampions.co.uk. That'd be great.
Lovely. Nice one.
Yeah, there's a whole lot of other stuff that's come up, David, as well. I'm thinking about, like this idea of safe uncertainty. Do you know about that concept?
Yeah.
Safe uncertainty.
Yeah.
I love that concept. And how do we bring that into all the other different things we do? Right, you guys are amazing. I love you. And by the way, I did listen that meaning, that belonging thing. I listened to that podcast episode.
Oh, right.
That's why I was like, oh yeah, I know what you're talking. The Tara, is it?
Tara, yeah.
Brilliant,
She's great.
brilliant,
Yeah.
Absolutely brilliant. Yeah. Amazing.
Good stuff. Lovely.
Right.
All right. Thanks so much. Nice to meet you.
Okay.
Hopefully.
Bye.
Take
Bye.
care. Cheerio.
How it is and how it should be, are racing in the streets again. One's got the other by its expectations. The other is going for a submission. Hope has stoicism by the neck. Acceptance is struggling for breath. Driving has it on the ropes, but what I want is being choked. My wheels being dragged through a hedge backwards. May you find kindness under that stone. May the thaw come early this year. That bridge is hoping should be finished this year. You can go